So one of the things I want to do in this channel is interact with people, even if they don't want to interact with me by doing a video with me. And that means answering questions that people would put on some of my videos that I do. So I want to start trying to do a better job of that. A good friend of mine, Rick, asked me a bunch of questions on a video I did on nationalism versus globalism and why I consider myself more of a nationalist than a globalist. So I just wanted to go through some of those questions and give the best answers I can to him. So let's go through. First, he asks, how does nationalism work to curtail the erosion of the middle class and the oligarchs controlling everything? I would argue that nationalism is more of an idea of a localized government than globalism. The larger governments we get, the more ability we have to have oligarchs abuse that power. So let's look example at California. In California, they have a system that's the most like globalist friendly or the progressive globalist model friendly of any state in the country. And by this, they say that we shouldn't have borders. We should allow things like illegal immigrants. We should have sanctuary cities. We should have the government take care of everyone. We should stop being so selfish as a country just alone. Silicon Valley's there. They want to be people that have basically unfettered access to other countries, one system of laws. And in there, we see that you have the wealthiest people in America, but you also see the poorest people in America. In other words, the income gap is bigger in California than anywhere else. Now, this is despite the fact you would think that would be exactly the opposite, seeing as how California is probably the most progressive state. You would say, wait a minute, don't they care about poor people? Surely that would mean that the gap between the wealthy and the poor would be smaller. The reason it's the exact opposite is because this is all lip service. Their plan is to make everyone dependent on them. They think that feels benevolent. That's exactly what a global system of governments looks at. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, globalism could take many forms. That's true, but I'm discussing the form that it is taking. So if you look at the EU, for example, they have similar policies as that in California. They believe in accepting millions upon millions of economic migrants. They believe on setting them up with free housing, healthcare. They believe in the free flow of people. They believe that instead of having individual governments, we should have more of a global type system. That's why Brexit happened, for example, because Brussels was declaring all these laws. The EU, in other words, their head office in Brussels was declaring all these laws that affected people in Britain. And none of that, since the EU, the income distribution, the wealth gap has actually increased throughout Europe as well. The rich have gotten richer, the poor have either stayed stagnant or gotten poorer. And we see this over and over. The times where we see the most increase of the middle class and even the lower class is when we have more like free markets and a less controlled government. And that's because we're talking then the smaller the government, the more localized it is. That means that private enterprises are allowed to happen and the money's not cheated off. You think of it this way, right? We know that the government's ripping us off in some ways, such as the fact that they print money from a private bank and then lend it out to wealthy people. They bail out corporations and things like that. The 2008 bank bailout. The bigger the government gets, the more it's able to do that on a grander scale. Locally, it's more difficult for your government to behave in corrupt manners like that because there's more accountability. For example, you know the people involved in your local government, or at least there's a better chance you do. The further you get away from that local government, the more corruption and the more oligarchical it gets. So we now have a system, you can even look at the difference between your local government versus your national government. It's almost like you have to be a wealthy elite to even get involved in national government. Well, global government's even worse. And so you end up with a bunch of these people that are basically, dynasties that are making laws for everyone. And they don't care about you as an individual. They don't care about your specific rights. Nationalism, it's not that nationalism helps the middle class necessarily, but it gives each country a chance to make their own policies. I think that our national policy, or the idea of the United States, was the greatest country that ever existed because it valued the individual and personal liberty above all. That's why we achieved the status we did. That's why economically we boomed in this country. The further we get away from that into more of a global approach, the more that the middle class and the lower class have been hurting in America. Second, it says, I poo-poo the idea of universal health care, even though many countries have it and the citizens report it's the happiest country on earth. Is there any universal health care you could support? I think that universal health care is probably better than the system we have now. I think the system we have now is terrible. You'd be hard pressed to purposely to have a system that would be worse if you were actually trying. I'm sure you could purposely come up with a worse system, but you know what I'm saying. However, I think that the private market approach is a better way to go, which I could get into it. I am open to hearing arguments about universal health care, though, because I do think that the status quo is not sustainable, and I will admit to not being ridiculously intelligent on that matter. But I do know this. Every time the government gets involved in something, it ends up making a mess of it. Now, you talk about the happiest countries on earth, the happiness statistics I forget what they call it, but they do a survey every year. And yes, you're right that countries that have like universal health care, such as those in Scandinavia, tend to be some of the happiest people on earth. But there's several things. One, a lot of those countries are switching to more free market approaches, even though they currently still have universal health care. And that's because what they're realizing is while they had kind of these insular, small populations that were not diverse at all, they were basically homogenous. So Sweden was basically all people that were ethnically Swedish that were born there. They didn't have a lot of migration and things like that. As the migrations increase, what they've started to see, and populations get more diverse and it gets larger, that things like this are becoming unsustainable. It's easy to have universal health care in a country. And the other thing to think about in all these countries is they were rich to begin with. They were rich in natural resources and other things like that. They had kind of capitalist type policies that allowed them to achieve great wealth, and then once they had that wealth, you had basically a class of people that were all homogeneously middle class or above, and they decided to have a more socialist system with things like universal health care. So what you saw is if everybody's making a similar, at least a baseline, pretty successful amount of money, and then they all decide to share cost, which is what universal health care is, then it ends up working very well because there's no one really grifting this. And I don't mean to say it like that, but there's not poor people that your then money's having to sustain. You're all basically making a reasonable income, and so you're just sustaining other people that have reasonable income. Now, if you take and apply that to a country like the United States, you see that there's huge diversity, which is good in a lot of ways. I'm not saying that, but there's a huge there's huge income disparity and things of that nature. So that means that what ends up happening is we see that a lot of people are going to end up paying for a lot of people to bump. And we could already see in the United States how things like this might fall apart. For example, the government-run health care we already have in the United States is the VA. How's that working out? Terrible. The conditions are unbelievably bad. And even when people say they're going to have change, like Trump, the change comes really slow, if at all, because there's a massive bureaucracy. And that's how things get lost in the shuffle. Now, having said that, I would still be open to seeing, having conversations on universal health care. I just know that it seems that every time the government gets involved in a problem in the United States with our unique situation, that it ends up making it worse. For example, take higher education. Why has higher education costs gone through the roof while the quality of education has declined? And the debt of all the students coming out of it is increasing exponentially. Well, it's because the government started to guarantee federal student loans and said that you couldn't declare bankruptcy to get out of them. So then the colleges were like, great, the government got involved. Now they're handing out free money to all these kids, it's absolutely guaranteed by the government because bankruptcy can't get rid of it. So we're going to raise our prices through the roof. And that's exactly what happened. There's no reason to think that universal health care in this country wouldn't do that. I think that our insurance system's a mess. We should have more private solutions. There should be cross-state lines insurance companies offer. I think we need to try to get insurance out of it as much as possible. But again, I don't have all the answers, and I'm open to hearing conversations on universal health care. Third, is statism better than nationalism? Should we work to keep moving in the direction of smaller government? Statism, I assume you mean like federalism. Yes, I am a federalist, which is the idea that each state should govern as much as possible, and we're kind of loosely tied as a federal government. Federalism is what the founders had in, that was their intention. And that's why we see things like the Electoral College and the way the Congress, or the House and the Senate set up. So in the House, you get is based on your population, how many representatives you get. But in the Senate, each state gets two. But that's because we wanted to have this idea of each state, at least in one branch there, had equal representation no matter what their population. Now, we've got crazy and expanding federal powers. I think we need a return to federalism. That actually would be a better thing. But that would still be nationalism. That's still separate from globalism. It's just nationalism to globalism is federalism to nationalism. I believe in a smaller, more localized government in any chance you can get it. Now, I do still favor the United States because the original idea was your military will be federal, your power to print and coin money, though somehow we've given up that right to a private bank called the Federal Reserve, but still, that was supposed to remain with the federal government because originally you had the Articles of Confederation, which were all these states just loosely collectively being together, but then you started to see currency problems, currency manipulation, trade wars, tariffs, things like that. And so they realized, whoa, at least as an economic bloc, we need to be together and we need to have the same military and things like that. But we see all the time over abuse of this, such as it specifically says in the Constitution, any laws not expressly granted in the Constitution to the federal government would be left up to the state governments. Yet we have the federal war on drugs. Well, that's ridiculous. If a state chooses to legalize marijuana or whatever drug, that should be up to the state. The federal government should have no business in that unless they pass an amendment or a federal law. But instead, it's so, and I didn't think that's very bad. I think we should leave it up to the states more. Now, one of the arguments you'll hear against illegal immigration, because Federalists tend to be right wing, so a lot of left wingers will try to shrewdly be like, "Oh, you're all for state rights, except when it comes to immigration." Well, yes, that's exactly right. That's because immigration and who to allow into the country is the purview of the federal government, which only makes sense. They're in charge of defense. They're in charge of who gets into the country. They're in charge of printing and quoting money, things like that. They shouldn't be in charge of things that aren't expressly outlined in the Constitution. So, 4, does nationalism solve the problem of people living off the government? No, not at all. That's a problem even under a nationalist system you could see. But it gets worse under a global government. The reason is this. The globalist system, the idea is people trying to consolidate as much power as they can and as much governance over as much people as they can. Now, there's two ways of looking at it. There's this would probably be a bunch of scary people that are acting in a crappy manner to do that. Or there's, let's give them the benefit of the doubt that they actually believe we know what's best for humanity. Individuals can't do what's best for themselves. Therefore, we need to govern over them. And we are the elites. We're able to do that. And that's what the idea of global government would be. The reason that that's going to be problematic is that it forces, as I said in this video that you asked these questions to, it actually is going to lead to an erosion of the middle class, because it allows wealth to consolidate more in the hands of the upper class, because there's all these policies that allow these businesses to go around the world and have, and garner more money in that way. They're not taxed by each country, for example. They don't have to listen to different laws of each country. But even more than that, that's just a petty aside, I guess. It's probably not even worth bringing up. Even more than that, it allows them to garner laws and have more control. Even though I'm not a leftist or a postmodernist, this is what the postmodernist Michel Foucault called biopower. And that's the idea of once you give the government the power to give you life, you give the government the power to take away that life. So when you become reliant on the government for services, things get worse. And again, we need only look to how this is applying in California. You might ask, well, wait a minute, how does exactly does this work? How did the wealthy get wealthier in that system and the middle class get poor? Well, take something like regulations, for example, or things like a minimum wage law. Like, I know, Rick, the person who asked these questions, you live in kind of a rural area. Let's say that the federal government comes out and says, oh, minimum wage is now $20 an hour. What do you think that would do to every locally owned business around here? They would immediately collapse. So then the wealthier would get, even though it seems like the poor, minimum wage went up, so the poor will make more. In reality, what happens is it just erodes the middle class, the small business owner, and then the wealthy are able to pass that cost back on. They're now paying $20 an hour, but they'll do all kinds of things. Like, they won't hire people full time, or they'll switch to robotics more, or lay off people, or they'll pass the cost on to the consumer, and the consumer ends up basically being the same type of people that are making $20 an hour. And inevitably what you see is a situation like in California where you're talking like paying $150,000 just for living, just to rent out an apartment in a lot of places in California. So people that are making $100,000 a year end up being homeless. That's what happens. That's the insanity of these regulations, and it leads to this two-tier system. And it's not just regulation, it's all kinds of other policies. It's basically the idea of taxing people, regulating, having government intervention massively under the auspices of, oh, we're helping poor people. But in reality, the middle class is the ones that will end up taking that burden on. But it doesn't matter, because you'll be told, look, even if you're middle class now, so what? You just become one of these people. There's still all these great benefits for you. So yeah, you're no longer middle class, but everything's taken care of for you. And then once that becomes the issue, then not everyone, but way more people become reliant on the government. And we see with things like this shutdown, it's a really precarious place to be reliant on the government for your sustainability, for self-sustenance, because the government might not always be there. Or they might decide you're a dissident if you're like a crazy conspiratorial person like me. Like, if you're reading 1984 or A Brave New World or one of those books, what if the government says, okay, we don't like your criticism, so no more food for you? I say, it almost sounds biblical. It sounds a lot like Revelations, right? Like, I remember learning in church, like with the mark of the beast, the idea was like, I'd be like, who would get this tattoo on their hand? Are you kidding? I read the stories. I know I'll end up in hell if I do that, but it could be metaphorical. Now, again, I'm not advocating Revelations and saying that's what I'm talking about, but it just brings to mind that it's a very scary thing. So, last, If wealth increases only benefit the upper class, won't that still be a problem at every size of government? Yes. And in fact, I did a video where I was talking about this. You have to ask it, like, when we're talking about capitalism versus, maybe it was this video that I'm responding to, but anyways, capitalism versus socialism. People will criticize capitalism and they'll say things like, look at the income disparity, the wealth gap. But you have to ask yourself a question. There's all sorts of things that we need to take into account. Would you rather have a system where there's a large gap between the richest and the poorest, but the poor are doing okay? Or would you rather that gap be shrunk, but the poor do less? They're doing worse. I would advocate for the first system, and I think nationalism would be able to solve that. But it doesn't solve necessarily the idea of income disparity. I do think that globalism exacerbates income disparity. The more government intervention you have at larger levels, the better chance for the people at the top to act in corrupt ways to influence that government to make sure they stay at the top. But just having nationalism... So I guess what I'm saying is this. With a lot of these economic problems I'm talking about, just having a nationalist system doesn't solve them. But I believe the further we get to globalism makes the problems worse. So we still need to be working under a nationalist system to be able to solve things like the income gap, the wealth disparity gap. Now, the reason, what was I going to say? When it comes to government intervention, why does it lead to the gap being bigger? Well, it was like I talked about before, because you're eroding the middle class the further you get to globalism. Again, that's why we see that happening in California. And we see that all over the place when we switch to socialist type systems where, the income disparity massively has shrunk because everyone got poor. So that's not going to be a good thing either. So, yeah, I appreciate the questions. If anyone ever has questions, let me know. I'll try to do a video like this once a week. But if you like this video, like and subscribe. I'll be putting more out daily. I have a live stream I do every Friday at noon. And I'll be doing a live stream tomorrow, I believe, at 4:30 on my friend Drone Tech's channel. So, all right, everyone, have a good one.